Suppose someone walked into the Pentagon tomorrow and claimed he could build a space drive faster than anything humans have ever produced by more than 10 times. A drive that could send dozens of people to Mars in a week, Pluto in less than a year, and, if the technology could eventually be developed to its full potential, perhaps even make practical interstellar flight possible. He calls it, wait for it, a warp drive. There's just one problem. He admits there's a 99.9% chance that he's wrong, but he says that for $1 million, he can conduct an experiment that will tell us whether his idea has any merit. If he's wrong, the money is gone. But if he's right, he may have just discovered the most important technology in human history. The question, should we give him the money? Most people would probably say no. After all, there's a 99.9% chance that the experiment will fail. Funding something with almost no chance of success sounds wasteful, irresponsible, maybe even crazy. After all, what would the taxpayers think? But a good poker player will ask a very different question. In poker, you don't win by winning every hand. In fact, one of the most important things a poker player learns is that the outcome of any individual hand tells you surprisingly little about whether you played it correctly. You can make a terrible decision and win, and you can make exactly the right decision and still lose. What matters is whether you consistently make decisions where the potential reward justifies the risk. Poker players call this idea pot odds. Imagine there are $10,000 in a pot. It costs you $100 to stay in the hand, and you estimate that you have a 5% chance of winning. Most people might look at those odds and say, I'm probably going to lose. And they're right. They probably are. But that's the wrong question. The right question is, how much does it cost me to find out? You are risking $100 for a chance to win $10,000. Even though you will probably lose this particular hand, playing it may still be the correct decision, and when you consistently make the correct decision in every hand you play, whether you win or lose, any particular hand, you find something amazing over time. You make money. And profit, not win percentage, is the gold standard that marks the champion poker player. And that raises an interesting question. What if technological research works the same way? Governments spend billions of dollars every year developing new technology. Some of that money improves things we already know how to build. Better aircraft, better rockets, better computers, better weapons. Most technological research is incremental. We build an airplane that flies farther, a computer that operates faster, a weapon that strikes more accurately. These improvements may be enormously valuable, but we can usually estimate roughly what success will mean. A new engine might increase range by 20%. A new computer might operate twice as fast. A new weapon might be significantly more effective than the one it replaces. But over time, these incremental improvements start to become more expensive to develop and produce less actual results. Eventually, every technology reaches the point where no incremental improvements can be made without spending more money than the improvement is worth. But occasionally, someone proposes something completely different. Nuclear-powered spacecraft, fusion energy, artificial intelligence, room temperature superconductors, or perhaps things beyond our very comprehension. These are not merely better versions of things that already exist. If they work, they may create capabilities that did not previously exist at all. The airplane did not produce a better horse. Nuclear weapons did not produce a larger artillery shell. The transistor did not produce a better vacuum tube. They changed that which was technologically possible. And that creates a strange problem for anyone deciding whether to fund speculative research. Because the more revolutionary the potential technology, the more difficult it may be to calculate the size of the pot. If the idea actually works, the payoff may not be 10 times the investment, or 100 times. It might create entirely new industries, alter the military balance of power, transform the relationship between nations, or change the very course of human civilization. This means that breakthrough technologies may require us to think about risk very differently from ordinary research and development, because the probability that a revolutionary idea will succeed may be extremely small, while the consequences, if it succeeds, may be almost impossibly large. So how much money should we be willing to spend investigating an idea that probably won't work, but would change the world if it did? I've been thinking about this problem for many years. I once encountered a fascinating example of it in a conversation with physicist Travis Taylor. Taylor was discussing one of the more controversial propulsion concepts of recent decades, the M drive. The M drive is supposed to produce tiny but real amounts of thrust without conventional propellant, using only microwaves. If it works, the implications could be enormous. There is just one problem. Most physicists think that the M drive is impossible because it appears to violate fundamental laws of physics. But Taylor made an observation that stuck with me. He believed that it might only take about $200,000 to conduct the experiments necessary to determine whether the M drive represented something genuinely interesting or whether it was simply junk science. But, and this was Taylor's point, nobody wanted to spend that money. Not NASA, not the DoD, not DARPA, nobody. And because nobody wanted to spend that money, M drive remains a distracting question, generating nothing but heated debate. That bothers me, because I think we tend to make a fundamental mistake when we think about failed research. We assume that if an experiment fails, then the money spent conducting it was wasted. But is that really true? Suppose we spend $200,000 investigating an exotic propulsion concept, and we conclusively prove that it doesn't work. What did we buy? At first glance, the answer seems to be nothing. But that isn't quite right. We bought information. We eliminated a possibility. We prevented scientists, engineers, governments, and private companies from repeatedly spending time and money investigating the same dead end. We learned something about the physical universe that we did not know before. And there may be another benefit. Someone had to conduct the experiment. Scientists were employed. Engineers gained experience. Equipment was built. Young researchers were trained. Brilliant but easily bored students may be inspired to continue their studies because they see that fascinating programs pushing breakthrough technologies offer viable career paths. New experimental techniques may have been developed. Perhaps something completely unexpected was discovered along the way. Suddenly, technological research doesn't look like a simple choice between success or failure. There may be many different kinds of return. You might get the revolutionary technology. You might get a useful piece of technology. You might discover new scientific knowledge. You might eliminate an unproductive avenue of investigation. You might train scientists and engineers. You might build institutions and laboratories capable of solving entirely different problems. And occasionally, you might discover something you weren't even looking for. So perhaps the real question isn't, will this technology work? Perhaps the real question is, given the potential consequences if this technology works, how much should we rationally spend to acquire better information about whether it will work? This might be a better question because there are really three variables: the probability of success, the magnitude of the payoff, and the cost of acquiring additional information. Most discussions about speculative technology concentrate almost entirely on the first question: will it work? But that might be the wrong variable to focus on. Imagine a government spending $100 billion improving chemical rockets, but refusing to spend $1 million investigating an idea that, however improbable, might make chemical rockets obsolete. The point is not that the exotic technology will work. It probably won't. The point is that the enormous disparity in potential returns may justify investigating even extremely improbable possibilities. Does the potential payoff justify the cost of finding out? You may recognize Travis Taylor from the television program The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. And whatever you think about UFOs, UAPs, strange phenomena, or the ranch itself, Taylor represents a particular kind of scientist, one willing to investigate questions that many of his colleagues might consider ridiculous. That doesn't necessarily mean believing extraordinary claims are true. It means being willing to ask a different question. How much would it cost to find out? Because sometimes the rational response to an improbable claim is to not believe it, and it is not necessarily to dismiss it. Sometimes the rational response is simply to conduct the experiment. If someone claims that something extraordinary is happening, there might be a 99.9% chance that the explanation is mundane. Perhaps the instruments are malfunctioning. Perhaps the witnesses are mistaken. Perhaps nothing unusual is happening at all. But what if a relatively inexpensive experiment could provide better information? And what if the consequences of discovering something genuinely unexplained would be enormous? Suddenly, we're back at the poker table. The question is no longer whether you believe. The question is whether the potential size of the pot justifies the cost of seeing one more card. And this is where the poker player shines. Because a professional poker player doesn't put all his chips into every promising hand. He makes decisions as new information becomes available. In Texas Hold'em, there's a deal, then the flop, then the turn, then the river. At every stage, the player learns more. And at every stage, he decides whether the new information justifies another bet. Does he check, raise, call, fold? Fortunes are won and lost from these decisions. So imagine our hypothetical warp drive again. The Pentagon doesn't actually have to decide, should we spend $20 billion building a warp drive? That may be the wrong question. Instead, we might ask, what is the cheapest experiment capable of significantly changing our estimate of whether this idea is real? Maybe the experiment doesn't even cost $1 million. It only costs $200,000. Run it. If the idea conclusively fails, stop. We've purchased our answer. By itself, that answer might be worth a modest cost. If the result is ambiguous, perhaps we make another small bet. And if the experiment succeeds, we increase the bet. $1 million, $10 million, $100 million for a prototype, an operational system. In other words, never wager the entire development cost when a much smaller wager can purchase the information necessary to decide whether the larger wager is justified. But there's one more lesson we must learn from poker, the dangerous and revolutionary one. In Texas Hold'em, any two cards can win. And that means there's a corollary to making small initial bets. You have to play enough hands to give yourself a chance of finding the unlikely winners. If you never pay the ante, you never see the cards. If you never see the cards, you never get the information necessary to decide whether to keep playing. And this becomes especially important when we're searching for breakthrough technologies. Because if genuinely revolutionary technologies were easy to recognize in advance, everyone would recognize them. The entire problem is that ideas capable of changing the world may initially look improbable, unpromising, perhaps even ridiculous. So betting small cannot become an excuse for refusing to make initial bets at all. Sure, we can't investigate everything, but neither can we limit ourselves only to the technologies that already look like winners. Because once we become too afraid to investigate unlikely possibilities, we're no longer playing the game intelligently. Eventually, we may discover that we're not playing the game at all. Years ago, while writing my book, Developing National Power in Space, I encountered an idea that suddenly seems remarkably relevant to this problem. During the Cold War, strategist Stephen Posny and science fiction writer and technologist Jerry Pournelle developed a theory they called the technological process. They argued that a new technology passes through 4 distinct and fundamental stages. First comes an intellectual breakthrough. Someone discovers a new scientific principle or gains a fundamentally new understanding of how the universe works. Later comes an invention breakthrough. Someone figures out how to turn that scientific knowledge into something that might actually become useful. Next comes a management breakthrough. Someone with access to money and resources decides that the invention is important enough to develop. And finally comes the engineering breakthrough. The invention becomes a real, reproducible, operational technology. I discussed this process years ago, but only recently did something occur to me. What if these stages are really betting rounds? At the beginning, we know very little. So we make a small bet, conduct the experiment, test the scientific principle. If the evidence becomes stronger, we make a larger bet, build the proof of concept. If that works, we make another decision, develop the prototype. And only after progressively stronger evidence is accumulated do we make the largest bet of all, production and deployment. The technological process becomes a sequence of increasingly larger bets justified by increasingly better information. And I think this changes the way we should think about highly speculative research. The choice is not really between spending nothing or spending billions. There is an enormous range of possibilities in between. And a nation that refuses to investigate improbable or even seemingly impossible ideas, because most of them will fail, may actually be making the same mistake as a poker player who folds every hand he is unlikely to win,
What a sick
regardless of the pot size. But breakthrough technologies create an even deeper problem, because a nation that fails to recognize an incremental improvement may become slightly less efficient over time. A nation that fails to recognize genuine technological revolution, however, may discover that the assumptions underlying its entire military, economy, and national strategy have suddenly become obsolete. The dreadnought, the airplane, the atomic bomb, the ballistic missile, the computer. Again and again, technologies have emerged that did not simply improve the existing world, they created an entirely different one. And the institutions responsible for making technological decisions must somehow distinguish between thousands of ideas that will go nowhere and the handful that will change everything. But this creates another problem, a very big one. A nation has limited resources. There are only so many scientists, only so many engineers, only so many laboratories, and only so much money. There are thousands of technologies we could investigate. Most will produce modest improvements. Some will fail completely, and a handful might change the world. So how do we choose? How much should we bet? When should we increase the bet? When should we fold? And perhaps most importantly, when we actually discover something revolutionary, how aggressively should we exploit our advantage before someone else catches up? Posny and Pornell spent years thinking about these questions, and they argued that technological competition had become so important to national power that nations needed an entirely new kind of strategist. They called him the technological general. We have generals trained to command armies, admirals educated to command fleets, executives trained to manage corporations. But who is developed to command a nation's technological frontier? Who decides which seemingly impossible ideas deserve a small bet? Who understands the difference between a technology that merely makes the existing world slightly better and a technology that might create an entirely different world? Who recognizes when the evidence justifies a larger bet? And who knows when to fold? And who knows when a breakthrough is so important that the nation should push every available chip into the center of the table? These aren't merely hypothetical questions. More than 60 years ago, American scientists proposed building a spacecraft unlike anything the world had ever seen. It would not be powered by chemical rockets. It would be propelled through space by the one technology Americans knew best: nuclear explosions. The spacecraft was called Orion. Most people who encountered Orion saw an extraordinary spaceship, but two young Air Force officers saw something else. They understood that Orion was not simply a better rocket. It potentially represented something far more important, a technology that could create military capabilities that had never before existed. They began asking what would happen if the United States actually developed these enormous nuclear spacecraft. How would they be used? How would they change warfare? How would they change strategy? How would they change the balance of power? And how should the United States organize itself to exploit such a technological revolution before its adversaries could even respond? Their names were Air Force Captains Donald Mixon and Fred Gorshboth. Almost nobody remembers them, but buried in formerly classified Air Force documents in the 1950s and 60s is the story of two young officers who tried to imagine the future of warfare before the technology necessary to create that future even existed. They looked at Orion and asked a question that sits at the heart of every technological revolution. Not simply, will it work? But what happens to the world if it does? And their story raises an extraordinary question. What happens when someone actually decides to make the bet? Here at Frontiers of Power, we neither automatically believe extraordinary technological claims nor automatically dismiss them. We ask what it costs to find out, what we might learn from failure, and what happens to the world if it succeeds.